haven't resumed yet.
You know, I was talking to Beth today at when I was signing books over at Union Market, and I mentioned possibly doing that if there was ever, you know, an interest in kind of a follow-up in doing a walking tour with you guys. And she was like, yeah, let's think about it. So
yeah. There's another person on our staff named Bob who handles that part of the operation. And because we do, you know, local trips and day trips like to Falling Water, and even foreign trips we used to do, and we're going to resume them next year. So so yeah, this would be a perfect candidate for one of them.
I would love to do that.
Yeah, okay, well,
Great,
I'll mention it to Bob. Yeah.
Okay, excellent, thank you.
Okay, so it's 8 o'clock, so if you're ready, Bashan will take us live, and then I'm going to pause for just a few seconds in the beginning while we let people come into the space. You know, you could see at the bottom, the number of participants will rise. And so I'll just let people get in first, and then I'll start. So Bashan, you ready?
Yes, sir. I'm going to be opening up the room in 3, 2, 1.
Okay, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to P&P Live. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Alyssa Muscatine. We have a very revealing event for you this evening, especially for all you Washingtonians, because our guest is Joanne Hill, who's here to talk about her new book, Secret Washington, D.C. A couple of brief housekeeping notes first, though. To post a question at any point, just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. The chat function also will be active, though for comments, not questions. Put your questions in the Q&A. But in the chat column, you'll also find a link for purchasing copies of Secret Washington, D.C. Joanne has lived in Washington for nearly 2 decades, writing about local experiences and also about travels with her husband on a blog called DCGlobejotters.org. She served as a DC public school teacher for 17 years before co-founding Capital Teachers, a tutoring company servicing the greater DC area. In Secret Washington, D.C., Joanne focuses, as her subtitle says, on the weird, wonderful, and obscure. She tells stories about scandalous and creepy spots, highlighting some of the capital city's darker past. She also writes about some of the iconic places in D.C. and a number of creative and innovative aspects of the greater D.C. area, including quirky art installations like Foamhenge in Virginia and Barbie Pond on Avenue Q, and oddly shaped and decorated homes like the Mushroom House in Bethesda and the Vanadu Art House in Hyattsville. It's really a fun and fascinating guide. Joanne will be in conversation with Andrea Peterson, a writer and artist here in DC. She covered technology policy for the Washington Post before leaving the paper several years ago and worked as an investigator at the Project on Government Oversight, and currently is a senior writer at the investigative nonprofit American Oversight, and produces creative projects under her Plain Great Productions brand. Please join me now in welcoming Joanne Hill and Andrea Peterson.
Well, thank you, Brad, and for the team at Politics and Prose. It is such a pleasure to be with all of you, and thank you all who are joining us today. I was at the Union Market location earlier today signing a bunch of books, and I had shared just how awesome this is. You know, Politics and Prose has been one of my favorite bookstores for a very long time, not just in DC, but really just throughout life. And so to be able to do a book event and to be able to be a guest is just such a special treat and such an honor. So thank you very, very much.
I'm so glad to be joining you to talk about this book, which is a wild and wonderful ride through our home city. And let's get started with talking a little bit, Joanne, about how you wrote the book. Like, how did this all come about?
Yeah, so it's kind of a crazy story in the sense that if you would have asked me 5 years ago if I ever had plans to write a book, I never would have had plans to write a book. I can tell you that. So long story short, as Brad mentioned, I do write a travel blog and a DC focused blog as well. And over a decade ago, my husband and I were traveling to Egypt, and we met a couple from Galveston, Texas, who we hit it off with right away and kept in touch with over the years. And so many, many years later, Christine, the wife of the couple, she had been following my blog and so forth and would share my blog with her community and so forth. And so she reached out to me in fall of 2019, and she texted me and said, hey, I'm writing a travel guide for Galveston, Texas. And I think that you should write a travel guide for DC. And of course, that took me by surprise. I don't know how to write a book, but she put me in touch with her publisher, Reedy Press, which now is my publisher. And before you know it, I was in contact with them, and I sent some writing samples. We talked through some possible topics and so forth. And a few weeks later, I had a book contract. And that's kind of how this all started. And it was as surprising to me as I, but it's one of those things that when an opportunity arises and it's a good opportunity and it's a promising opportunity, you say yes and you make it happen. So that's kind of how it started. Yeah.
Well, and I know actually once folks read the book, it will not be a surprise to anyone that you're an author. It's just a fun collection of tidbits and stories and history, and I'm a history nerd, so it all worked out perfectly for me. And actually, if I can do a little bit of narcissism, let's talk a little bit about why I'm here actually talking to you about it, and that's because I'm in the book.
So you are in the book, and I want you to talk about your beautiful artwork. And we're going to talk about several artists who are featured in my book, but you, of course, are prominently featured in my book for your amazing 10,000 penny shower stall. And of course, I know you have so many other, pieces of art and around your house and so forth, but I came across your story in DC. So during my research, I researched, and found so many different sources, and that's how I came across your story. And then got in touch with you, contacted you and said, hey, can I come to your house and see your shower?
And I said, of course, because I love to show people my shower, as it turns out. The full story here is that my husband and I have gone through a really belabored home renovation over the last few years. And a big part of it was trying to build in a lot of special, unique pieces that tied our history with the city into it. And one of them is a giant, 7x5, which is significantly taller than me. You can't tell right now, but I'm a very small person. I'm like 5 foot. I'm basically the same size sitting as standing. So we put in this giant feature piece in our basement shower that is a mosaic of 10,000 pennies, which is actually only about $100. But let me tell you, it's very, very heavy when you have to pick them up from the local bank. You also get a lot of strange looks when you go in asking for $25 to $50 worth of pennies at a time. A lot of questions, which I'm always eager to share, that I use them for these large art installation pieces. The one in my own basement is actually probably the most famous of it. It was very strange to go local viral for my bathroom, but since in DC, shared and wrote an article about it, as did some of the other local news site, and the Mayor Muriel Bowser and the DC Council also tweeted it out, which was a fun little surprise. And since then, I've done a number of other pieces, including a lot of portraiture or work specifically related to history events and the abolitionist John Brown. I'm originally from Kansas, and I'm actually there for a brief visit now, and I've been doing a lot of artwork related to that I'll probably try and talk about later. But I'm always looking for sort of trying to turn sort of ordinary pieces, documents, pennies, little bits of information into sort of extraordinary items.
Yeah. And so, I mean, it's a pretty incredible piece, and it's, something that initially, when you think of, a shower stall that is decorated, adorned with pennies, you're not sure what to expect. But when my husband and I came over, I mean, we were blown away with just how stunning it was, how accurate it was, and just how bright and lustrous it was. I mean, it really is a piece of art that I think it for sure exceeded expectations. And I mean that, and I already had high expectations, so to say the least. But yeah, I mean, you were one of, like I said, several artists who I was able to meet throughout this project, which I would say is probably, I would say, one of my favorite parts of this project. And I have a lot of favorite parts of this project, getting out and exploring and being able to go outside, especially during the pandemic as I was researching outside places, but also getting to meet fascinating people who I probably would have never met if it wasn't for this project, right? I mean, you and I probably would have, our paths may have not crossed if it wasn't for this book. And I think other artists as well who I met, and musicians and so forth. And so that was a gift, and that was something that happened very just organically, but also just really delightful that happened. Yeah.
Yeah, I know that you featured actually some of my favorite sort of other outsider pieces of art in the book, including in James Hampton's The Throne of the Third Heaven of the Nation's Millennium General Assembly, or just The Throne, which is a piece of work by, as I said, James Hampton, who's an artist who lived in Washington, D.C., but was really largely unknown during his lifetime, but created this beautiful, immersive piece of religious art that is now featured in the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Let's talk about it for a little bit.
Yeah, so when I started writing this book, I sought out some friends who are historians and tour guides and curators and people who I knew. And I met with one individual who was just such a wealth of knowledge. And he led me to the Throne of Third Heaven, among many other places in the book. But he said, and he couldn't, he's like, there's this huge, enormous art installation in the American Art Museum, and I don't remember what it's called. It has tinfoil, and it's made of all these different scraps and so forth, and you need to go see it. And so, of course, the following weekend, I went to the art museum, and I think you and I were talking about it, Andrea. It's what's fascinating is that when you go see it, you can't believe that you never saw it before, because it is so huge, right? It is immense. It is an enormous structure. But at the same time, it is often overlooked, right? In the sense that, it's not the neon map that people obviously go to often, or like the main places that people
like
often
the portrait gallery in the President's Hall. Like those people know, but like if you go, it's on the main floor. It's kind of like off almost, I think, past a gift shop. You access like this, and sort of there usually are other rotating galleries, but part of the permanent exhibit there in the sort of far corner on the main floor is this enthralling throne.
It's incredible. In my book, I call it, like one man's junk is another man's masterpiece. And it truly is a masterpiece, but it's created out of recycled materials, right? Tinfoil, coffee cans, jelly jars, furniture, flower vases. I mean, kind of like everything in the kitchen sink. And it took about 14 years or so to create this structure. And what's fascinating is James Hampton, he did this pretty privately and pretty quietly. Most people didn't know he was doing this. And he did this in this carriage house that he was renting. And so about 14, he started in 1950. So in 1964, I believe, he passed away. And it wasn't until the landlord discovered this masterpiece after he passed away. And then of course, it eventually made its way into the Smithsonian Art Museum. But it's,
where it belongs.
Where it belongs. And actually, it's so revered by the Smithsonian that when they were doing renovations and they reopened in 2006, it was the first piece of art reinstalled into the museum. So that's how revered it is. It's incredible. It's 2 levels. It's completely symmetrical. The right side is, tribute to the New Testament and Jesus. The left side is to the Old Testament and Moses. I mean, it is a stunning piece of art. You do not have to be religious to appreciate just its magnitude and just how incredible it is. So yeah, that was one piece of art. I know Brad mentioned the Vanadu House. Should we talk about that?
Let's talk about that.
So the Vanadu House it's interesting because there are a lot of parallels between the Vanadu House and the Third Throne Heaven, in the sense that it's the use of recycled material and a lot of junk that you wouldn't necessarily think belongs in art, and yet it works. And so Clark Bedford, he is the individual behind the Vanadu House. It's in Hyattsville, about 7-8 miles away. And I have not met Clark Bedford in person yet, just because of the pandemic, but we've spoke many, many times. Actually, he emailed me today. We talk on the phone, and he is quite a character. And I mean that in all the best way. He's lovely and wonderful.
All of the best people are characters.
Yes. And so, but you know, he's a former museum conservator, and he basically decided to transform his very, you know, typical house into this piece of art. And by using, you know, mosaics and mirrors and kind of license plates and all these things, and has this really eccentric, highly ornate house. And he also has 4 cars that are very ornate, and he drives them around, and they make all this noise, and they of course attract a lot of attention, which he loves. And so it's another place that's in my book that it's worth going to and making the trip. And he takes people on tours if you want, and so forth. And so pretty fascinating. So anyway,
no, definitely his house is sort of my long-term art goal. It's probably not my husband's long-term art goal, but I think we can work towards it, maybe make some compromises. He'll probably let me at least do a weird art vehicle long-term.
Well, like, Clark is the man to ask. He's the guy to talk to if you ever want me to connect to you. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I know. And I think you mentioned that you're hoping to do an event with him later this summer, and I'm 100% first in line for that.
Once we solidify a date, I will let you and the world know. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Speaking of other characters, I would like to talk about James Mendelsohn.
So Jason Mendelsohn is the man behind all of the Metro songs. And so he's kind of considered like the Metro guy. And so he is another wonderful guy. He's originally from Florida and moved to DC. And as a musician, decided that he wanted to pay tribute to the city that is now his adopted city. And he wrote a song for every single Metro station. There are 91 Metro stations in the whole.
It's a lot.
It's a lot. It's actually more than I ever knew, right? Because you think about, you go all the way to Vienna and Greenbelt and so forth. And so the 91 songs, they span 8 albums. And it took him about 6.5 years or so to complete this project. But I think what I love about this project is it's such a quirky project, right? But also the songs are very-
They're good.
They're good. And they are indicative of the neighborhood where that Metro station is. And he really does pay tribute to the neighborhood. So for example, Congress Heights Metro Station, for example, is about St. Elizabeth's Hospital, which is actually featured in my book, which was a very crazy connection. But you know, St. Elizabeth's Hospital was like the first federally run psychiatric hospital in the nation. And it's still over in that area, but that song focuses on that. And so if you go to each song, it really highlights the neighborhood, the culture, the people. But what I like about it is like the albums kind of connect, just like the Metro kind of connects these neighborhoods together too. And so he's a great guy, not as, I would say, as, you know, eccentric as Clark Bedford, for example, you know, a little bit more reserved, but just wonderful. He used to perform a lot at 930 Club and other places. I think, you know, after everything slows down with the, you know, things kind of start to reopen up, we're also looking to do maybe a joint event. So I'll keep you all posted about that. But his songs are great. They're available on like Songkick and so forth. So he's awesome. Yeah. And the songs are, like you said, they're good. They're really good.
Like, and I didn't mean to suggest that they would be otherwise, but you know, sometimes when you do like a concept album, you stretch it out a lot, and 91's an awful long concept album. It's more than 69 love songs, and I'm a big Magnetic Fields nerd.
Yeah, absolutely.
I actually have like a concept album of like a series of feminist murder ballads that I wrote a few years back under my folk band name Mid Mountain, but there's only a handful of them. There are not 91, but if you want to find them, they're on Spotify and pretty much everywhere else under Mid Mountain, all one word.
Excellent. I think that we should maybe get into some scandals and controversies that are in the book. Yeah.
There are plenty to choose from.
So, and when I say scandals, some of them are not dark and dismal, and some of them are fun, and some of them are And then also just some stories about some iconic places in DC. So why don't we start with the more like light and then we'll go a little dark. Does that sound okay?
Let's do it.
Yeah. Okay, so obviously a lot of places in my book are off the beaten path places that people might not know about. So for example, Chuck Brown Memorial Park in Northeast, which is a lovely park. Or International Park in Upper Northwest where Newton apple tree has been cloned and replanted there. So those are some places that people might not know much about. But of course, the National Mall is, you know, is obviously known and for good reason. And so there are a lot of places in my book featured on the mall, but more so about the history or the hidden stories or maybe secrets of those iconic places that people might not know as much about. So one place, and this is one of my favorite stories in the entire book, is about the Carousel on the mall. And so the Carousel actually came from an amusement park in right outside of Baltimore called Gwynn Oak. And this carousel was there. And on the same day in 1963, excuse me, that Martin Luther King delivered his I Have a Dream speech, that amusement park, Gwynn Oak, discontinued segregation. And so it was also the same day that an African-American child rode on the carousel with 2 white children. And so it was really incredible and really kind of, you know, exemplified King's message of, you know, racial harmony and integration and so forth. And so fast forward, that carousel eventually made its way to the mall, right? And so of course it's there in the mall. And that story wasn't known until years later. And when that story came out, I mean, what an amazing story. And actually now if you go to the carousel, there is a plaque that commemorates that story of the children riding on the carousel together. But it's also how incredible that the carousel sits at a spot not too far of where King delivered the speech, right? And so it's all kind of, that's one of my favorite stories and a very feel-good story. There's another, on the National Mall, another nice story that I like is at the World War II Memorial. If you look behind the Pennsylvania pillar, there is what looks like graffiti. It's a sketch, and it's of this bald-headed man with this very long nose, and that there's an etch that says Kilroy was here. And so the reason why that graffiti is there today is that during World War II, this actual graffiti, this piece of art, quote unquote, was kind of found at different places around the world where battles were fought. And the whole point of this graffiti was to let soldiers know while they were in battle that they were not alone, that someone was there, Kilroy was there. So it was just kind of remind these frightened soldiers, like, you're not alone, even though you are in this terrifying, dangerous situation, someone is here to give you comfort. And so next time you're at the World War II Memorial, if you go behind the Pennsylvania pillar, you have to really look for it. It's just, you know, and it's interesting, right? I've been to that memorial countless times. I go running there, I walk my dog there. I never would have known it was there. And I definitely didn't know the story before researching. So it's a nice place to go and visit and just to see and just to kind of know the story behind it, for sure.
And it's also just a nice piece again about how art sort of connects us all.
Exactly, absolutely.
And you find it in the places that you may least expect it.
1000%, yeah.
I have another finding things in a place that you least expect it one from the mall before we go on to more tragic stories there. The miniature Washington Monument that's underground.
This was so fun to find. So as Brad mentioned, I am a former DC public school teacher and I taught 3rd grade. And in 3rd grade in DC public schools, you teach in social studies all about DC. So it's all about the city of DC, landmarks, memorials, monuments, neighborhoods, and so forth. And so I have taken students on the mall and to the Washington monuments countless times. I've had park rangers come for visits and so forth, right? But I found out through my research that there's actually a little replica of the Washington Monument that measures 12 feet tall, and it's underground. So it's under a manhole. But what's really cool about this, this replica, it's meant to be as helping with a system, like a part of for surveyors, as part of a system that helps maps and synchronize maps all around the country. So it's part of like a 1,000,000-point system. But what's interesting is usually these markers that do this are not replicas of, you know, a national monument. They're metal rods or metal cups or something like that. So it's really quite fascinating that instead they chose to do a 12-foot replica. And so you can't see it, it's covered, but in, I'm just checking dates to make sure. In 2019, the National Park Service actually did unveil it to individuals, and people were able to see it for a very short amount of time, and ooh and ah over it. And then it was deposited again underground. I have been told that if you find the right park ranger and so forth, it's right next to the Washington Monument, so it's in that area. Some park rangers will help you find it and will even uncover it. I have not been able to do that yet. So but there are stories of some park rangers. It's there, and it's worth trying the next time you see a park ranger. So,
and I throw it out here, park rangers, generally very helpful, wonderful people. They have the good stories. You should ask them. I mean, there are they may not have all of the good stories in Joanne's book, but generally they're very useful, wonderful people.
When I was researching this book and I was out on the mall and so forth, and this is a little bit before the pandemic, when they were, park rangers were out and about a little bit more. I mean, I went on walking tours. I did so many things, but I would go up to park rangers and just ask questions and say, hey, I'm writing a book. Like, do you have a couple minutes? Especially I would find individuals who are by themselves, not leading a tour and so forth. And every single individual, and not just park rangers, but, docents and tour guides, were more than generous with their time, and they want to share their information with you. They want to share their knowledge, and they're excited to share that. So ask questions, because I promise they will tell you things that they know that you may not know. So but we have some dark things on the National Mall.
Let's talk about bad things.
Okay, so let's talk about some bad things. So one of the bad things, and then I'll talk a little bit about more like a fun story. So in front of the National Gallery of Art, that used to be a railroad station. It was Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station. And that was actually where James Garfield was assassinated. So President James Garfield, our 20th president, he only served for 4 months. He was assassinated. He was shot there. And the story is though very bizarre in the sense that the gentleman who shot him, his name is Charles Guiteau. He was an attorney. And so a self-proclaimed attorney, but he was definitely someone who was, known in society and was a pretty, prominent individual in society. He campaigned for Garfield, but he became quite obsessed and quite delusional. And so he felt that he was kind of the individual who was responsible for winning the election, right? So winning the presidency, he thought that he single-handedly kind of did this, whereas he was not responsible. He did a couple campaigns.
He was a man who had a lot of delusions. I actually read this fascinating book about him several years ago, specifically about his trial. I believe it was literally called The Trial of the Assassin Guiteau. That was about how this was actually his trial was actually a landmark case in how we handled sort of insanity defenses at the time, because he was one of the first high-profile cases to try and claim that defense.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what's even kind of crazier about this story is, so he's delusional and he feels slighted, right? He wants more of a role in the president, in the administration. He doesn't get it. Garfield kind of dismisses him, and he becomes very angry, and he has resentment, and he ends up shooting Garfield. But what's even kind of, to make it even more tragic, is that Garfield didn't die right away. And actually, it's been kind of discussed that, if it was today or more modern times when medicine was more advanced or instruments were sterilized, right? He actually probably could have lived. So they were, for, about almost 2 months or so, doctors were probing him, and, but they were like sticking instruments in him that were not sterilized and caused.
Turns out it's a good thing to wash your hands. Yeah. And we learned that a little bit too late for President Garfield.
Right. And so, and also they continued to feed him really like rich food that he obviously couldn't handle. He wasn't well enough to handle this really rich, indulgent food. And so, it's Guiteau definitely shot him and so forth, but he definitely died just because of modern medicine and just lack of knowledge at that time. And so it's kind of, so yeah, very short presidency, 4 months. And yeah.
1800s, not a good time to be shot, although frankly,
No.
there's never a good time to be shot.
Never a good time to be shot, but definitely not in the 1800s when medicine isn't as advanced as it is today.
Do you want to talk a little bit about some spooky things related to the Lincoln assassination?
Oh, yes. I can talk. I actually have two great.
Several. You have many options, Joanne. Where do you want to go?
Well, it's crazy too. And I did a podcast a couple weeks ago, and they asked me, was there a certain era that you found yourself researching more? And the Civil War era, for sure. And a good amount of entries in my book revolve around the Civil War era, and especially Lincoln. It's fascinating, right? And of course, a devastating, dark time for our country and so forth. But yes, so if you go to, we're going to go off the mall for a little bit, but then I want to go back to the mall. Remind me to go back to the mall after these two stories. If you go to Chinatown and you go to the restaurant Walk and Roll, which is you should go to and eat there,
but more importantly, do the karaoke.
Yeah, it's I remember karaokeing there many years ago when we first moved here. So in Chinatown, next time you go, you will see it probably. There's a small plaque that commemorates that. It used to be a boarding house. It was the Mary Surratt boarding house. And so during the Civil War, Mary Surratt and her husband, they buy this space, it's converted to a boarding house, and her husband passes away. And so she then, runs this boarding house, and individuals obviously would come in and out. But notably, the people behind, plotting to kidnap and assassinate Lincoln are coming, and including John Wilkes Booth. She ends up working with them and actually provides them with guns and other things.
She's helping out.
She's helping with the plotting of his assassination and so forth. And so she actually, in history, was the first woman in American history to be executed for her role by hanging. And so she obviously was found guilty for her involvement in this plot. And of course, everything that happened. So now, many years later, it is a Asian restaurant that gives
a delicious one with great karaoke that you can enjoy the history at when you're nearby.
But has a little bit of, some dark history behind it. And then speaking of Lincoln, Mary Todd Lincoln is fascinating.
She is a character, if you will.
She is a character. And I learned a lot about her. The entry in my book about Mary Todd Lincoln is, so during the Civil War era, seances, spirit circles
spiritualists.
Yes, became pretty popular and popular among many individuals. So whether you were an elitist, whether you were, of considered high society and wealthy, mostly
you probably believed in ghosts.
You probably believed in ghosts, and there was a good chance you attended these seances or spirit circles, mostly because you were trying to reconnect with someone who may have died in the war, right? And so sadly, a lot of individuals did turn to these seances because there was so much death and so many casualties that that was the way to connect. And so that's what Mary Todd Lincoln did. She attended seances, and she was a believer that she could be connected with her son, Willie, who died. And so these mediums would come and they would run these seances, and there were, wrappings on the wall, and there was, sounds and maybe scratching on your arm and pulling the hair and so forth. So President Abraham Lincoln, he was known to attend a couple with his wife. Based on my research, not so much because he believed in the occult, but more so just because he wanted to check it out, right? He wanted to see if they were credible. He wanted to make sure his wife was careful and being protected and so forth. Well, long story short, there was this one individual medium who he doubted. And this individual claimed that he was a duke, or an illegitimate son of a duke. And so Lincoln had his reservations about this man and kind of sought out and talked to different individuals and kind of had people investigate. And of course, after some investigation, found out this man was indeed a fraud. So, but of course, this gentleman was angry that he was called a fraud and threatened to kind of, disclose Mary Todd Lincoln's participation in these seances. But also though to say, people knew that she was participating. There was gossip, people had an idea.
Like, she had a reputation for, like, even during her day, for sort of being in the like offensive terms of the time, sort of like a hysterical woman and etc. When in fact she was a woman who dealt with a lot of death and trauma within her immediate family, and I think turned to different resources to try and manage that. Another thing, which this is like a fun sort of side trip of this, that sort of after Lincoln's death, she also was the target of a sort of ghost photo fraud person named Charles Mumler, who took like basically double exposed pictures of things that showed like the loved ones of people hovering over them as sort of and was saying like, oh, I can capture the spirits of your loved ones around you. And instead, like in this new technology of photography, but was instead like the subject of another like really aggressive lawsuit about like fraud in photography and spiritualism.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. I mean, you really have to feel for what she went through. I mean, so like you said, just so much tragedy surrounding her. But the other thing the news kind of they kind of put a kibosh on it, and it never kind of went out or got out. But when they were there was stories that she still continued to, it didn't deter her. She still participated and attended seances and spirit circles in the White House. And I have a good story in my book that we don't have to talk about right now, but that is just about, stories of the White House being haunted and different individuals seeing, the ghost of Lincoln and so forth. But she, again, wasn't deterred. And there's no evidence that President Lincoln joined her at these seances at the White House, just at the Soldiers' Home, which is now Lincoln's Cottage, which I know I go to often for bluegrass festivals and so forth.
It's a really beautiful part of town.
Yeah, exactly. So that's Mary Todd Lincoln and her participation in seances. And then, which kind of leads me to many other fascinating women.
Yes.
I researched and wrote about. And so one of my favorite stories, I had mentioned the Carousel was a favorite. I mean, I love all the stories I wrote about, but of course you do.
It's like choosing a favorite child, I'm sure.
Right. But you do have ones that kind of, not children, but you have ones that kind of stand out or resonate with you a little bit more, right? And so this is another one that resonates with me. So the Museum of American Indians. So now we're back on the National Mall. The Museum of American Indian was actually a former brothel. And so this brothel was owned by a madam, Mary Ann Hall, who is buried in Congressional Cemetery, along with many prominent people. Actually, I have two great entries in my book that take place in Congressional. But this brothel that she owned, where the American Indian Museum now stands, wasn't just any brothel, right? It was one of the most prestigious, one of the most successful.
It was the good brothel.
It was the creme de la creme of brothels. And during this time, during the Civil War time, there were about 100 brothels, give or take, in the city. Brothels,
it was a happening place.
It was
still a happening place, but happening in a very different way then.
Right. So there was this area between, let's see, like Capitol Hill and Federal Triangle, give or take, that was called Hooker's Division. And this is where a lot of the brothels stood. And I mean, if you think about it, during the Civil War, individuals, especially traveling men, were coming into the city, soldiers and generals and so forth. And so brothels became a huge, huge business. And so Mary Ann Hall opened up this brothel. And like I said, it was pretty much considered the most successful brothel in the city, which for someone as a woman during that time to be this leading businesswoman, and she was highly respected. She was a socialite. She was not judged or looked down upon, and she was known to also take care of her women. So she provided health care. She made sure that they were taken care of and so forth. But years later, of course, after digging and so forth for the American Indian Museum, when they were excavating the land, they found a lot of artifacts and remnants from the brothels. They found, champagne flutes, and they found china dishes and porcelain and things that kind of proved they lived a quite
evidence of people having a good time.
Yes, but also that they were pretty well-to-do, like things that a lot of people didn't have access to, like champagne flutes and so forth. So they were living quite a nice life and doing very, very well. Yeah. I think we probably only have a couple more minutes.
Yes, we've only got, I think, 2 to 3 more minutes left of us just chatting, and then we're going to go and take some questions. So
can I quickly talk about some other just great outdoor places, just because I know,
yes,
I think one of the things that I want to kind of stress is that when I was writing this book, I started before the pandemic, right? I started in fall of 2019. And then of course, in March 2020, kind of everything changed. And so some places that I wanted to be featured in my book, I just couldn't get to. They were closed. I didn't know if they were going to open. It was, and so I shifted a lot to outdoor places. And so places that I could get to, places that honestly were also kind of gave me, helped my sanity to be able to go out and explore and so forth. But also I knew that my readers could get to, and of course, being that they're outside, free. And so the Arboretum for sure, right? And so
it's my spot, to be honest. It's like absolutely where I've escaped through the most during the pandemic.
It's amazing. So I have 2 entries in the book about the Arboretum, one being the Capitol columns and just the
which people know, like they're hard to miss.
They're hard to miss. They're 22, they're huge, they're stunning, and they came from the Capitol, the US Capitol, and they're stunning. But then also the other entries about the bonsai collection and the infamous bonsai tree. So the Banzai Museum is this great museum within the Arboretum. But what's amazing about this particular tree is that it survived the bombing of Hiroshima in 1945. And so
it is, and it's hundreds of years old. It's
about 400 years, give or take. And what's also incredible is that, in like 1912 or so, Japan gifted a bunch of bonsai trees, I think about 53 or so, to the Arboretum, and this was one of them. And so this survived the bombing, and fortunately, so did its owners in Japan. They survived as well. But then years later, the grandsons of the gentleman who owned this house and the bonsai tree came to visit the Arboretum from Japan to see the tree that belonged to their grandfather and that had survived. So it's just this like beautiful story that it's just wonderful. Yeah. What are some other outdoor? I went to a place that I found myself in a lot of cemeteries. There's a bunch of cemeteries featured in this book.
I have one outdoor place and then one cemetery story.
Yeah.
And then we will go to the phones, as it were, which is actually the Q&A text. I know we have a few questions in there, and so feel free to pop in with some more folks. So my outdoor spot is Mallows Bay. It's south of town a bit, but it is a ship graveyard where they have sunk all sorts of things from all sorts of different naval engagements and all sort of different eras of the U.S. naval history. And you can launch there, kayak, and on clear days, just like look down and see all of these ships' ruins. It's eerie and beautiful, and I thoroughly recommend a good kayak trip out there. Although I also thoroughly recommend a good kayak trip almost anywhere.
Yeah, no, that was a fun place to discover. Yeah, Mallows Bay and shipwrecks.
And then my one cemetery story is actually about a place that's no longer there. So the Colombian Harmony Cemetery was once where the Rhode Island Metro stop is now, and it was one of the Freeman's African American cemeteries that was built after the Civil War. Among free African Americans before and after the Civil War. It housed a lot of the bodies of a lot of really luminaries of the African American community here in DC, including Mary and Carrie Shadd, who was the first Black female lawyer in the US who graduated from Howard here, or her home is on the National Registry here, as well as Osborne Perry Anderson, who was the sole Black survivor of John Brown's raiding party on Harpers Ferry, who lived to tell this phenomenal story of it through a book that you can easily find online because it's in the public domain, called A Voice from Harpers Ferry. If you have not figured this out, I am a huge John Brown nerd. I do a lot of artwork related to him and also sort of the connections between Kansas history and the Free State and Exodusters movements, which is free people who moved to Kansas in part because they were inspired by the Free State movement and sort of epitomized by John Brown's activities out there against the border ruffians of Missouri.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's incredible just how many amazing places. And I want it really quickly for Mallows Bay, which is so great, because I wrote about it and I haven't been able to kayak there. They just started to open up kayaking tours once again. And so I'm going kayaking there when the shipwrecks in July. And so you can now book a tour and go there, which is amazing. And
you don't even need your own kayaks now.
Yes. And my one last outdoor place that I want to talk about, and then Q&A that I can't believe we didn't
do it.
Keep it short, Barbie Pond.
Yes, we missed Barbie Pond.
So Barbie Pond and Avenue Q, which I know Brad mentioned at the very beginning, is it's in Northwest on Q Street between 14th and 15th. So like DuPont Logan Circle. And what it is, it's basically, it's the front yard of a couple who lives there that you can just walk by on the sidewalk, and they are artists and they have pretty much tried to keep themselves anonymous, right? Most people don't know who they are. Even when I was corresponding with them through Instagram messaging, you know, I don't know their names. They're very nice, but so they basically do these art installations with Barbie dolls, but they are incredible. And so what's great is that
they change all the time.
Like once a month or so, they rotate these installations and these displays, but they're always themed, right? And so if you go during Halloween, it's incredible. If you go during St. Patrick's Day, you know, so they do a lot around holidays, but then they also do themes around the political climate, right? So during the election, they have these great installations about, you know, urging people to vote and so forth. They also do themes about inclusion. They also do themes about pop culture. They're just so smart, so creative, so much more than just Barbie dolls. In fact, every time I go, I leave with a big smile on my face, and people just walking by, just stop, look. I mean, literally, you know, and then right now I think, or at least the last one I saw on Instagram was the Roaring 20s. And so they have these Barbie dolls dressed in flapper dresses with champagne flutes and so forth. And I love that it's, you know, kind of like paying tribute to the Roaring 20s in the 1920s, but also now as we kind of emerge out of the pandemic and the city starts to reopen now, like the 20s are kind of roaring again. So they're clever, they're smart, and they're very innovative, and it's a feel-good place to go. Barbie Pond.
Yes. And if you want sort of regular updates on the Barbies, you can obviously find them on Instagram, or I first discovered them, I think, through Prince of Petworth or the Popville blog, which is a pretty well known, like, local internet haunt.
Yeah.
But
I think we might have some questions.
Yes, we have questions. Let me go over those. I'm going to give a little bit of priority to a person I actually know and answer a lot. I have here this question from my friend Neil Gordon. Are you planning to write another book? And because I know the answer, Joanne, go for it.
This is a great question. I actually, very happily, the last 2 weeks, I signed 2 new book contracts with my publisher. And
I can't wait to read them.
The next book is a scavenger hunt. It's a scavenger hunt throughout the city, and it's going to take through 17 neighborhoods throughout DC, maybe Old Town as well as some other places outside the city. And I'm currently writing that right now. It's written very differently. It's riddles and so forth. It's super fun. And then after that one, I will be writing a book about unique eats and eateries and restaurants and so forth throughout DC, and stories about restaurateurs and just, so yes, I am super excited for these upcoming projects, both DC focused. Thanks for the question.
It's going to be so good. We also have another one about a character that, we talked about out in our prep meeting, but we didn't get to answering live here from Robert. What about the harmonica guy?
Oh, is Hoff here? Oh my goodness. Hoff is this amazing, amazing individual and just human being. And he is this incredible, creative, eccentric man, and I mean that in the best way, who owns the largest collection of harmonica cases in the world. He owns over 500.
I'm blown, totally blown.
And they're incredible. They are pieces of art, and they are they're designed to hold his harmonica cases. He works very closely with different artists and to design them, very meticulously. They're beautiful. Some are focused on Vermont, where he spends a lot of time in the summer. Some are family focused, and some are focused on, different travels that he's taken. And so he and his wife were so generous to invite me and my husband to his house in Virginia about a year ago or so. And we were able to see his collection and just marvel at the collection. And he told us so many fun stories about them, and they're incredible. None of them are for sale, but they're an amazing collection to see. And I'm really fortunate that I got to meet Hoff, and we talk still regularly. And it's just a wonderful, wonderful individual.
All right, we have a bunch of questions coming to him, which I'm really excited about. Somebody here was like, hey, are there going to be any images shared? I'm sorry for not doing that immediately, but I did share some in the chat afterwards, and I'll share some more here at the end because we've talked about so many cool things. And I also wanted to flag a question from D. Loeffler here. Do we have favorite gargoyles at the National Cathedral? I do.
Oh, so I have a story about the cathedral in my book, but not about a gargoyle. So if you want to take that one, Andrea.
Yeah. So the National Cathedral is covered by different gargoyles. And my favorite one, because I'm a nerd, is that there's a Darth Vader one up there. So the very darkest of the dark side, assuming that you, like I have, mostly blocked out what happened in the latest trilogy. I like this one. What's a good place in our book that you would recommend for a first date, Joanne? What's the most romantic spot that you covered? I know we covered a lot of gory things, so let's find someplace cheerful.
Okay, so that's a great question. I would say definitely somewhere outside. Well, yeah, let's stick with outside. So there is the Franciscan Monastery, which is in Brooklyn. Now the story in my book is about the underground catacombs, which are cool, and they're underground passageways and tunnels, and they were actually replicated from the catacombs in Rome that monks created. So that's the entry in my book. However, the draw, though, if you ever go to this monastery, the grounds are immaculate and they're pristine. I was actually just there a couple weeks ago in all of its bloom. They are stunning, and I don't know if a lot of people know about the monastery, and people can go and walk around. And it is beautiful. It'd be nice for a first day that you can walk the gardens. There's an upper level and a lower level. There are different chapels and so forth, but it's just stunning. The grounds are probably some of the most meticulously pristine garden grounds, greenery that I've seen in the city. That I would say,
definitely beautiful,
right?
Yeah,
I think that's what I would say. Or
I have one other from your book as well, I think.
Yeah.
And we didn't quite get to her, but the Joan of Arc statue in Malcolm X Park, who has a sword that is constantly being stolen. And I want to make one weird shout out to the DC musical scene. There's a meme about Carly Rae Jepsen getting swords given to her by fans. And there is a DC cover band that occasionally comes out called Gnarly Rae Jepsen that if you ever have an opportunity to see, I recommend. Also a good first date opportunity if you can find them.
That's a great, Meridian Hill Park is a great open space. That's a nice, you can bring your picnic and so forth. But yeah, the Joan of Arc statue, the story in my book is the number of times her sword was stolen 3 different times. And hopefully now secure, thanks to, the National Park Service and so forth, but it took quite a while. But that's a great date place too. I just think a lot of outdoor places, right? So the Arboretum is another great date place, I think. Rock Creek
Oh,
Park,
absolutely.
right?
It's perfect.
The
And,
capital.
you know, I will again plug Mallows Bay and kayaking. Nothing's more romantic than the water. And like assuming that you guys have separate kayaks, so if things go bad, you can go your separate ways.
Absolutely. Yeah. So go outside and explore.
So, and here's another one from Sakshi Halan. You know, what things did you discover during the pandemic that surprised you? I know there were plenty of places, but like, is there something that just made you go, I couldn't believe that was there? I know it's all secret DC, but I'm sure you have a lot of ideas.
So how about like a crazy story?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. So if you know the big chair in Anacostia?
Yes.
Okay. So
maybe not everyone will know the big chair, so maybe explain the big chair.
Okay, so if you, not too far from the Anacostia Metro is this enormous wooden chair. It's huge. You can't miss it. It's very, very big, and it's I'm gonna see if I can, let me find it really, really quickly so I don't give anybody any wrong information. So the chair is huge, but it's actually the replica. It's not the original chair. So it's on Martin Luther King Avenue and B Street in Anacostia. So I go to Anacostia for various reasons, and so I've known this chair and I've seen this chair, and again, it's humongous. You cannot miss it. But the crazy story that I found about it is that years ago there was this furniture store. So like in the late 1950s, this furniture store wanted to do a publicity stunt to get them attention and free advertising and so forth. And so the original, why not, right? So the original chair was almost 20 feet tall and about 4,600 pounds, okay? It was, at the time, the largest chair in the world, at the time. It's no longer the largest chair. But what's crazy that I found is that they decided they built this glass cube up top, and they hired a model to live there. So this glass cube had 3 closings, with an opening where people would, bring up food and other things. And she lived there for 42 days on top of this cube. And this was the way to attract attention and so forth. She was paid $1,500.
That's awesome.
She eventually couldn't take it and left the cube. But now, like the chair that's there now is not the original chair, it's a replica. But again, it's a chair that I have walked by numerous times. And to know this crazy, bizarre, really weird story that this woman lived there for over a month.
Yeah, that whole thing happened.
Pretty wacky. So that was maybe one of the surprising things that I discovered. More of a story for sure.
All right, and we have like a few more here. This one coming in from Cynthia Edwards. Where did you start looking for places to write about? What was your first research point?
Yeah, so my first research point was, so when I was a teacher, an individual, his name is Tim Krepp. Maybe people might know him. He lives in Capitol Hill. He was a former parent of mine at my school, and he is a tour guide, a historian. He's written some books, and he is just wonderful. He's a wealth of knowledge. As soon as I signed my contract, I contacted him and say, hey, can we meet for coffee? Because I'm writing a book and I would love some insight. And so we met at a coffee shop in Capitol Hill. I brought my computer, and he literally he was the one who gave me the idea for the Throne of Third Heaven. He told me about some scandals, some controversies, and I was just typing and taking copious notes. And so I would say he kind of got me started. He gave me probably about 25 to 30 ideas for the book, and the majority of them made the book. So from there, then of course, you research something, you go and explore, you talk to a tour guide. I went on walking tours with DC by Foot, Scary DC, all the tours. You talk to tour guides, they give you stories, they give you ideas, and then they lead you to someone else. So that's kind of how it evolved. Like I said, I talked to park rangers. I talked to everybody and anybody who was willing to talk and had information. And like I said, I was very lucky in the people who I met. That's kind of how it started.
As a reporter, I can say usually talking to people is the best way to find things out. And it sounds like you did a great job of it. I know you talked to me and, almost everyone else you mentioned in the book, and that's a lot of conversations.
A lot of conversations, but I mean, just how they were so valuable, right? I mean, they were invaluable really for this project to succeed. So yeah, but Tim Krepp really kind of is who launched it all. The knowledgeable tour guide. He gave me a lot of information. Yeah.
All right, this is going to be our final call for questions, and then I'm going to have to answer one from my friend Julian, who would like to know if there are any other occult, Masonic, Lovecraftian beliefs that are featured in 19th century architecture, or this is largely an in-joke because we play a lot of Lovecraftian board games together, but I bet you can come up with some weird things.
Well, I don't know if
What's the strangest architecture?
Okay, I don't know if it falls under all that that category, and so excuse me if it doesn't, but I am thinking about, I have a story about the Pentagon being like, why, there are theories about the Pentagon being connected with the Illuminati and actually being like the secret headquarters of the Illuminati. It's not really the occult per se, and I understand that. It's, it's kind of like, that hidden society, but so I don't know if that really answers that question, but it was fun to research and fun to kind of read about all these like different theories and, conspiracies and so forth. And yeah, I don't know if that was the best answer to end off on.
Way to throw us off topic at the end here, Julian. But speaking of going off topic, at the very end here, my virtual background of my bathroom seems to have finally loaded. So here's the whole image. And if you would like to see more of my work, I'm at plaingreatproductions.com or on Twitter at Kansas Alps, and I've got a few original pieces that I'm about to put on sale right after this, along with some prints, some of which are about monsters attacking DC, because that's the kind of person that I am.
Well, many thanks for moderating, Andrea. And Joanne, you've shown that even in a city as extensively visited and written about as Washington, there's still more to discover. And now you've given us a guide filled with other fascinating places not to miss. To everyone watching, thanks for tuning in. A reminder that in the chat column, you can find a link for purchasing copies of Secret Washington, D.C. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.
And thank you very much for having me. And Andrea, it was such a pleasure. So wonderful. Thank you again. I can't thank you enough.